Before we march into what might be the most disturbing story I've ever covered, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button, whether you're a veteran who served in Vietnam or someone who's just fascinated by the unexplained. Just know that the story you're about to hear comes from multiple sources who were there, who saw it happen, and who've spent the last 50 years trying to forget. This isn't about ghosts in the traditional sense. This is about something far worse. Soldiers who refused to stop fighting, even after they were dead. And the living soldiers who had to watch them march, night after night, through the jungles of Vietnam. The year was 1968, and the Vietnam War was at its peak. The Tet Offensive had just shattered any illusions that the war was going well, and American casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. For the soldiers of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, their area of operations was the Central Highlands near the Cambodian border, dense jungle territory where the North Vietnamese Army moved freely, and ambushes were a daily occurrence. Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Callahan had been in country for 7 months, long enough to be considered a veteran, but not so long that he'd become numb to the constant fear. He led a squad of 11 men, most of them barely out of their teens, trying to survive their tour and get back to the world in one piece. This is the smoke pit, and this is the true story of the marching dead. It started after a particularly brutal firefight near a village called Phuoc An. Bravo Company had been conducting a search and destroy mission when they walked into an NVA ambush. The fighting lasted 3 hours, a vicious close-range battle in dense jungle where you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. When it was over, Bravo Company had lost 19 men killed and 32 wounded. The NVA casualties were impossible to determine because they'd dragged most of their dead away during the fighting, but blood trails suggested the number was high. The Americans secured the area and set up a defensive perimeter to wait for medevac helicopters. The dead were lined up in a row, covered with ponchos, waiting to be flown back to base. Callahan helped carry several of his friends to that grim line, men he'd shared cigarettes with just that morning, now reduced to 80s under green plastic. As darkness fell, the medevacs still hadn't arrived. Some mechanical issue, some delay in the chain of command, it didn't matter. The dead would have to spend the night in the jungle, and Bravo Company would have to guard them. This doesn't feel right, Private First Class Marcus Washington said. He was 18, from Detroit, been in country for 3 weeks. Leaving them out here like this, it ain't respectful. We don't have a choice, Callahan told him. Medevacs will be here at first light. Until then, we keep watching and make sure Charlie doesn't come back for another round. They set up a perimeter with overlapping fields of fire, posted guards in 4-hour rotations, and settled in for what they hoped would be a quiet night. But the jungle is never quiet. It's full of sounds, insects, animals, the wind through the trees. After a while, you learn to filter out the normal sounds and focus on the abnormal ones, the sounds that mean danger. At 0200 hours, Callahan was on guard duty with Washington when they heard it. Footsteps. Not the careful, stealthy footsteps of enemy soldiers trying to infiltrate their position, but regular, rhythmic footsteps. March cadence footsteps, coming from the direction of the dead. "Staff Sergeant," Washington whispered. "You hearing that?" Callahan heard it. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the sound, Washington right behind him. They approached the line of bodies, and what they saw made both of them freeze. The bodies were moving. Not all of them, just some of them, maybe 6 or 7. They were standing up, poncho covers falling away, and they were forming into a marching column. 2 files, 3 or 4 men in each file, spacing themselves out exactly like they'd been trained. And then they started to march, not shambling like zombies in a movie, not lurching or stumbling. They marched with proper military bearing, keeping cadence, maintaining formation, moving through the jungle like a squad on patrol. Except these men were dead. Callahan could see the bullet wounds, the massive trauma that had killed them. One man was missing half his head. Another had his chest cavity torn open. But they marched anyway, as if death was just another obstacle to push through. "What the fuck?" Washington breathed. "What the actual fuck?" Callahan wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to do anything except stand there watching dead men march past his position. But he couldn't move. None of the guards could move. They just stood there, paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were seeing. The dead soldiers marched in a circle around the perimeter, one complete circuit. Then they returned to their original positions and lay back down. The ponchos settled over them again, and it was as if nothing had happened. "Did we just—" Washington couldn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," Callahan said. "We did." They reported it to Lieutenant James Morrison, the platoon commander. Morrison listened to their account with a skeptical expression that gradually shifted to concern as he realized they weren't joking and weren't suffering from combat fatigue. "You're telling me our dead stood up and marched around the perimeter?" "Yes, sir. Both of us saw it. Clear as day. Well, clear as you can see anything in the jungle at night. Anyone else see this?" They checked with the other guards. 3 of them had seen it. The others had been facing different directions or had their attention on potential threats from outside the perimeter. But 5 witnesses was enough to make it real. Enough to make it something that couldn't be dismissed. Morrison made the decision to keep it quiet. "We don't report this. Not to company, not to battalion, not to anyone. You understand? We report dead bodies walking around. They'll think we're all crazy. They'll pull us off the line, send us for psych evals, maybe give us Section 8 discharges. None of that helps us survive this war." So they kept it quiet. The medevacs arrived at dawn, and the bodies were flown out without incident. Bravo Company moved to a new area of operations, and everyone tried to forget what they'd seen that night. But 3 days later, it happened again. They'd been in contact with an NVA unit, nothing major, just a brief firefight that left 2 Americans dead and several wounded. The bodies were secured, medevac called. Same routine as before. But this time, the helicopters arrived before nightfall and took the bodies away immediately. That night, at 0200 hours, Callahan was woken by the sound of marching. He grabbed his rifle and moved to investigate. Other soldiers were already up, drawn by the same sound. And there, marching through their position, were the two men who died that afternoon. They marched right through the camp, weaving between sleeping soldiers, maintaining perfect formation, heading deeper into the jungle. Callahan followed them, keeping his distance, too shocked to do anything else. The dead soldiers marched for about 200 meters, then stopped at a small clearing. They stood at attention for a moment, then simply collapsed, falling to the ground like marionettes with cut strings. Callahan approached, carefully, rifle ready, but there was no threat. They were just bodies now, truly dead, not moving. He radioed back to camp for help, and a team came out to retrieve the bodies. Lieutenant Morrison looked at the scene and then at Callahan. "They walked here? From our position?" "Yes, sir. I followed them the whole way. Why here? What's special about this clearing?" They searched the area and found the answer. More bodies. Old bodies, weeks or months old. American soldiers based on the uniforms and equipment. Some were barely recognizable, jungle decay having done its work. But they were arranged in formation, laid out in neat rows like they were waiting for inspection. "Jesus Christ," one of the soldiers whispered. "It's a graveyard. They were coming home." The platoon medic, Specialist Roger Chen, examined the bodies. "These men have been dead for a while. Different units based on the insignia. They've been reported, MIA probably. And something brought them all here. Something made them march to this spot and lay down together." Morrison got on the radio and reported the discovery of multiple American remains. Within hours, a graves registration team arrived by helicopter to process the site. They found 23 bodies in total, all American, all arranged in military formation. Every single one of them had been officially listed as missing in action. The graves registration officer, a captain named Miller, interviewed the platoon. "How did you find this site?" Morrison couldn't tell him the truth. "Patrol stumbled across it during a sweep of the area." Miller accepted the explanation, but Callahan could tell he suspected there was more to the story. As the bodies were being loaded for transport, Miller pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation. Callahan couldn't hear what was said, but Morrison's face went pale. Later, Morrison gathered his squad leaders. "Captain Miller told me something I wish I didn't know. This isn't the first site like this they've found. There have been others scattered throughout the Central Highlands. Clusters of MIA bodies, all arranged in formation, all found in remote areas far from where they died. And in every case, local units reported unusual activity before the bodies were discovered." "Unusual how?" Callahan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Soldiers seeing things. Dead men walking. Formations of troops that vanish when approached. Sounds of marching in the jungle at night when no units are operating in the area. So it's not just us," Washington said. "This is happening everywhere. It's happening wherever American soldiers are dying in significant numbers." Miller thinks it's some kind of mass psychosis brought on by combat stress. The psychiatrists have a term for it: collective hallucination. They think we're all seeing things that aren't there because we're traumatized by watching our friends die. "But we found real bodies," Callahan protested. 23 bodies that were really there. "That's not a hallucination." "No, But the fact that they were arranged in formation, that's what the shrinks say we're adding from our own minds. They think the NVA is collecting American dead and arranging them to mess with our heads. Psychological warfare. That's bullshit, Chen said. I've seen what the NVA does with American dead when they their hands on them. And it's not respectful formation. It's mutilation. Booby traps. Leaving them where we'll find them in the most disturbing ways possible. Morrison nodded. I know. But that's the official explanation, and we're stuck with it. So here's the order. If you see anything unusual, you report it to me first. Not to company, not to anyone else. I'll decide whether it needs to go up the chain of command. And if you see dead soldiers walking around, you keep your mouth shut because nobody wants to hear it. And it won't change anything, except maybe getting you pulled off the line. So they kept quiet. But the marching continued. Over the next 2 months, Bravo Company lost 37 men killed in action. And at night, at least once a week, the surviving soldiers would hear the marching. Sometimes they'd see the dead soldiers walking through their positions, heading toward destinations unknown. Other times, they'd just hear the footsteps, the steady rhythm of boots on jungle floor, the sound of men marching to war, even though the war had already killed them. The soldiers developed coping mechanisms. They learned not to look too closely at the formations that marched past in the night. They learned to distinguish between living soldiers and dead ones by subtle differences. The dead marched in perfect unison, never broke formation, never made any sound except for footsteps. The living, even well-trained soldiers always had some variation, some human imperfection. I think they're going home, Washington said one night, after watching a formation of dead Marines march through their position. Marines, not Army, which meant they'd come from a different unit entirely, drawn by whatever force was collecting the American dead. I think whatever's making them walk, it's trying to bring them all together, like they're forming up for one final mission. What kind of mission? Callahan asked. I don't know, but have you noticed? The numbers are growing. Every week there are more of them. Bigger formations, more organized. At first it was just squad-sized elements, 10 or 12 guys. Last night I counted 47. That's a full platoon. What happens when there's a company's worth? A battalion? Callahan didn't have an answer. But Washington's words haunted him, because he'd noticed it too. The dead were organizing, gathering, forming into increasingly larger units, and they all seemed to be marching in the same direction, north, toward Cambodia, toward the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the fighting was heaviest and the casualty bodies were mounting. What if they're building an army? Chen suggested. All the American dead gathered together, marching as one force. An army of the dead. To what end? Morrison asked. The dead can't fight. They can't shoot, can't move with tactical awareness, can't do anything except march. Can't they? Chen pulled out a notebook where he'd been keeping records. I've been tracking the sightings. The dead soldiers we've seen, they're not random. They're specific people. And I've been checking against casualty reports. Every dead soldier we've seen walking was killed in combat, not by accident or disease. They were combat casualties. soldiers who died fighting. So what if they remember? What if whatever's animating them, whatever's making them march, also preserves their training, their muscle memory, their combat instincts? What if the reason they're gathering is because they're planning something? The thought was terrifying. An army of dead soldiers, immune to fear and pain, unable to be killed because they were already dead, marching towards some unknown objective. What could anyone do against something like that? We need to follow them, Morrison decided. Next time we see a formation, we follow them to wherever they're going. Find out what they're doing. What's causing this? Because if Chen is right, if they're building up for something, we need to know about it before it happens. The opportunity came 3 nights later. Bravo Company had set up a night defensive position on a ridge overlooking a valley. Good visibility in all directions, easy to defend. At 0200 hours, right on schedule, they heard the marching. This time, it wasn't just a squad or a platoon. It was at least 100 soldiers, maybe more, marching in company formation through the valley below. Morrison had prepared for this. He'd handpicked a small team. Callahan, Washington, Chen, and 2 other soldiers known for keeping their cool under pressure. They'd stay back, observe from a distance, and follow the dead to wherever they were going. Remember, Morrison said as they prepared to move out, we're ghosts. We observe only. No engagement, no matter what we see. If they detect us, we break contact and fall back to the perimeter. Understood? Everyone nodded. They blackened their faces with camouflage paint, checked their weapons, and moved out into the night. The dead soldiers were easy to follow. They made no attempt at stealth, marching openly through the jungle, and they seemed to possess some kind of awareness of the terrain that allowed them to move without stumbling over roots or getting caught in the thick undergrowth. The living soldiers followed at a distance of about 50 meters, close enough to keep the formation in sight, but far enough that they could take cover if needed. The jungle at night was its own kind of horror. Absolute darkness, broken only by filtered moonlight, sounds of nocturnal animals. The constant awareness that enemy soldiers could be anywhere. But this night, the enemy wasn't the NVA. It was something far stranger. They followed the dead soldiers for 2 hours, moving deeper into the jungle, farther from friendly territory. At one point, they passed through an area Callahan recognized as a known NVA staging area, a place where intelligence suggested enemy troops gathered before operations. But there were no living NVA here tonight. The area was empty, abandoned, as if even the enemy knew to avoid the marching dead. Finally, the formation ahead came to a halt. They'd reached a large clearing, maybe 200 meters across, surrounded by dense jungle on all sides. And the clearing wasn't empty. It was filled with dead soldiers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all standing in perfect formation, row after row after row, organized by unit, all facing north. Jesus fucking Christ, Washington whispered. It's an entire brigade, maybe more. Morrison pulled out binoculars and scanned the clearing. I'm seeing insignia from at least a dozen different units. Army, Marines, even some Air Force. These are soldiers from all over Vietnam, all gathered here. How is this possible? Look at them, Chen said. They're not moving. They're just standing there, at attention, like they're waiting for orders. The formation they'd followed marched into the clearing and took their place among the others, filling in gaps, maintaining the overall structure. Once in position, they stopped moving, just stood there, completely still, completely silent. An army of the dead, assembled and ready, waiting for something. What are they waiting for? Callahan asked. I don't know, but I don't think we want to be here when they get it. They were about to withdraw when something else entered the clearing. Not more dead soldiers, but something different. It came from the north, moving through the jungle with a sound like wind through dead leaves. At first, Callahan couldn't see it clearly. Just a shadow, darker than the surrounding night, moving with purpose toward the center of the assembled formation. As it entered the clearing, filtered moonlight revealed its form. It was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in a way that suggested it wasn't bound by normal physical laws. Where it passed, the dead soldiers turned to track its movement, their heads swiveling in unison, though their bodies remained at attention. The entity reached the center of the clearing and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then it raised its arms, and the dead soldiers responded. As one, thousands of them raised their weapons to port arms position, a precision movement that would have been impressive even from living, trained troops. The entity lowered its arms, and the dead soldiers shouldered their weapons. It's commanding them, Morrison breathed. Whatever that thing is, it's in control. It's organizing them. The entity began to move through the formation, inspecting the troops like a general reviewing his army. Everywhere it went, the dead soldiers snapped to even more rigid attention, their focus absolute. Callahan watched through his rifle scope and felt his blood run cold when he got a clear look at the entity's face. It had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. But despite lacking sensory organs, it clearly perceived everything around it, moving with confidence, examining each soldier with what seemed like approval. We need to leave, Chen said urgently. Right now. Whatever that thing is, we don't want it to know we're here. But it was too late. The entity stopped its inspection and turned toward their hiding position. Despite having no eyes, Callahan had the absolute certainty that it was looking directly at him. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing moved. Then the entity raised one arm and pointed directly at them. Every dead soldier in the clearing turned as one to face their position. Thousands of dead men, all looking in their direction, all perfectly still. And then, simultaneously, they began to march, not toward the team, but around them, encircling their position, cutting off any retreat. Fall back, Morrison ordered. Move! Move! They ran, crashing through the jungle, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Behind them, they could hear the marching, the steady rhythm of thousands of boots, getting closer. The dead didn't run, didn't need to. They just marched, relentless, tireless, herding the living soldiers like prey. "We can't outrun them!" Washington shouted. "They'll just keep coming." "Then we fight." Morrison stopped and turned, bringing his rifle up. "Form a perimeter. We hold here." It was a desperate move, but they had no choice. The 5 soldiers formed a defensive circle, weapons pointed outward, as the dead soldiers approached. The first ones emerged from the jungle, marching in formation, weapons at the ready. But they didn't fire. They just kept marching, getting closer. "Do we shoot?" Callahan asked. "I don't know. They're still American soldiers, even if they're dead." The moral dilemma was paralyzing. These were their countrymen, their brothers in arms, soldiers who'd died fighting the same war. How do you shoot at that? But as the dead soldiers closed to within 20 meters, that question became academic. The entity appeared behind them, that faceless figure, and it raised both arms. The dead soldiers raised their weapons. "Fuck it! They shoot! We shoot!" Morrison opened fire, his M16 barking in the night. The rest of the team followed, pouring rounds into the approaching formation. The dead soldiers took the hits without reaction, bodies jerking as bullets struck home. But they didn't fall, didn't stop, didn't do anything except keep marching and keep their weapons pointed at the living. And then they fired back. The firefight was surreal. The dead soldiers didn't take cover, didn't use tactics, didn't do anything except march forward and shoot. But their aim was perfect, every round placed with mechanical precision. The living soldiers had to dive for cover, rolling behind trees and into depressions, trying to avoid the incoming fire. One of the condemneurs in Morrison's team, a private named Jackson, was hit in the shoulder. He went down screaming, clutching at the wound. Chen dragged him behind a tree and tried to render aid, but more rounds were impacting around them, bark and wood splinters flying. "We can't stay here," Callahan shouted over the gunfire. "We're going to be overrun. Break contact and run," Morrison ordered. "Chen, can you carry Jackson?" "I'll manage." They ran again, Chen half carrying, half dragging the wounded Jackson, while Morrison, Callahan, and Washington provided covering fire. The dead soldiers didn't pursue at running speed. They just kept marching, maintaining formation, following at that same steady pace. But that was enough. They were tireless, and the living soldiers were already exhausted from 2 hours of trekking through the jungle. They burst out of the tree line into a small clearing and nearly ran into an NVA patrol. 5 enemy soldiers just as surprised as the Americans. For a frozen moment, both groups stared at each other, weapons raised but neither side firing. Then the dead American soldiers emerged from the jungle behind the Americans. The NVA soldiers saw them, and their eyes went wide with terror. They didn't hesitate, didn't try to engage. They ran, abandoning their position, fleeing into the jungle like men pursued by demons. And maybe they were. Because the dead soldiers, seeing new targets, shifted their attention. They stopped pursuing the American team and instead turned to follow the fleeing NVA. "Did that just happen?" Washington asked, panting. "Did the zombies just save us from Charlie?" "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth," Morrison said. "Move, before they change their minds." They made it back to friendly lines just before dawn, exhausted, traumatized, and with one wounded. Jackson was medevaced out, and the rest of the team was debriefed by their company commander, Captain Richard Hayes. "You're telling me you followed dead soldiers to a clearing where thousands of them were assembled and being commanded by some kind of entity?" Hayes's skepticism was evident. "Yes, sir. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you've been in the shit too long and your mind is playing tricks on you." "All 5 of us, sir? All seeing the same thing? And how do you explain Jackson's wound? He was shot by someone, and there were no NVA in that area, according to intelligence." Hayes didn't have a good answer for that. He filed the report as a contact with unknown hostile forces, which was technically true, and recommended the team for R&R, rest, and recuperation. But Morrison refused. "With respect, sir, we can't leave. Not now. Something's happening out there, something big. Those dead soldiers, they're organizing for something. And that entity controlling them, it's not friendly to anyone, American or NVA. What do you suggest?" "We need to go back. With a larger force this time. We need to disrupt that gathering before whatever's being planned comes to fruition." Hayes considered it. "I'll take it to battalion, but I'm not promising anything. The official position is that this is mass hallucination brought on by combat stress." 3 days later, Hayes called Morrison back to his command post. "Battalion says no. They won't authorize an operation based on unconfirmed reports of supernatural activity. However, there has been a significant decrease in NVA activity in the sector where you encountered these formations. Intelligence thinks the enemy might be pulling back to reinforce another area. So we're being tasked with a reconnaissance in force to determine NVA strength and disposition. Sir, if we go into that area with a large force, then we'll have the manpower to deal with whatever we find. Morrison, I'm not saying I believe your report, but I'm also not saying I disbelieve it. I've been in this war long enough to know that strange things happen. So we're going in with 2 full platoons, heavy weapons, and air support on standby. If your dead as soldiers are out there, we'll find them, and we'll deal with them." The operation was scheduled for the next full moon, when visibility would be best. Bravo Company would move in 2 columns, sweeping through the area where the gathering had been observed, with orders to investigate any unusual findings and report back before taking action. Callahan spent the days leading up to the operation checking and rechecking his equipment, making sure everything was in perfect working order. He had a feeling they were going to need every advantage they could get. The night before the operation, Washington found him cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time. "You thinking what I'm thinking? That we're about to walk into something way worse than any NVA ambush?" "Yeah, the NVA. At least they're human. They bleed, they die, they feel fear. But those things out there, they're already dead. How do you kill something that's already dead? You don't, Chen said, joining them. You disrupt the thing controlling them. That entity, that faceless thing, it's the key. We take that down, maybe the dead soldiers stop moving. And how do we take down something that isn't even human? Same way we take down anything else. Overwhelming firepower and the will to survive. But Callahan wasn't so sure. He'd seen the entity, seen how it moved, how the dead responded to it. It wasn't just controlling them like puppets. It was connected to them somehow, part of them. And he had a terrible feeling that facing it directly was going to cost more than any of them were prepared to pay. The next night, Bravo Company moved out into the jungle, 60 soldiers strong, armed for a major engagement. They moved in combat formation, every man alert, every weapon ready. And as they approached the area where the gathering had been observed, they began to hear it, the marching. Distant at first, then growing louder until it surrounded them from all sides. They'd walked into a trap. The dead soldiers had been waiting for them, and now there was nowhere to run.
All elements, form defensive circle, Captain Hayes ordered over the radio. M60s to the perimeter. Riflemen fill the gaps. Prepare for contact from all directions. Bravo Company moved with practiced efficiency, forming a circular defensive position in a small clearing. The two M60 machine gun teams set up at opposite ends of the perimeter, creating overlapping fields of fire. The rest of the soldiers spaced themselves evenly, creating a hedgehog defense that could respond to threats from any angle. The marching grew louder. Through the trees, Callahan could see movement, formations of dead soldiers approaching from multiple directions, converging on their position. He estimated at least 400, maybe 500. Bravo Company was outnumbered almost 10 to 1. Hold your fire until I give the command, Hayes said. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. The dead soldiers emerged from the tree line, marching in perfect formation, weapons at the ready. They formed a ring around Bravo Company's position, standing at a distance of about 50 meters, just standing there, waiting. The living soldiers aimed at them, fingers on triggers, but Hayes hadn't given the fire command yet. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "permission to try communication. With dead men, with whatever's controlling them. It responded to our presence before. Maybe it can be reasoned with." Hayes considered for a moment, then nodded. "Try it. But be ready to hit the dirt if they open fire." Morrison stood up, making himself visible, and called out into the night. "We don't want to fight you. We're American soldiers, same as you were. Talk to us. Tell us what you want." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ring of dead soldiers parted, creating a gap, and the entity walked through. It moved with that same unnatural gait, that same wind through dead leaves sound. When it reached the center of the gap, it stopped and stood there, faceless head turning, as if surveying the living soldiers. Then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Not sound in the traditional sense, but something that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the mind. And what it said made every man there wish it had stayed silent. You are trespassing. This is our ground now. The ground watered with blood, consecrated by death. You do not belong here. This is South Vietnam, Hayes called back. We're here on orders, defending it against communist aggression. South, North, communist, capitalist, these words mean nothing to the dead. We recognize only one truth. You sent us here to die, all of you. Your government, their government, all governments that feed young men into the machine of war. You sent us to die for words, for concepts, for pieces of ground that will be forgotten by history. And now we are reclaiming what is ours. What do you want? We want to rest. But we cannot rest while the war continues, while more young men are sent to die, while more blood soaks into this cursed earth. We cannot rest. So we rise, we march, we gather. And when we have gathered all the dead, when every soldier who fell in this war stands with us, we will march one final time. March where? Everywhere. To Hanoi, to Saigon, to Washington, to Moscow, to every capital that sent soldiers to die here. We will march through their streets, through their halls of power, and we will show them what they created. We will show them the cost of war in ways they cannot ignore or forget. An army of the dead, testament to their failure, reminder of their crime. Callahan felt a chill run down his spine. The entity wasn't threatening violence. It was threatening something worse. Truth. The undeniable, unavoidable truth of war's cost, marching through the streets of the nations that waged it. How do you ignore an army of your own dead? How do you justify sending more soldiers to die when the ones you already killed come back to show you what you did? That's impossible, Hayes said. The dead can't march forever. They'll decay. Fall apart? We are beyond decay, beyond entropy. We exist in the space between life and death, preserved by the same forces that animate us. We will march for as long as it takes, decades, centuries, until every person who supports war, who votes for war, who profits from war, sees the faces of those they killed. You'll start a panic. People will see you as a threat, not a message. They'll try to destroy you. Let them try. We are already dead. What more can they do to us? Bombs, bullets, fire? We've endured all of that already. We endured it in life, and we will endure it in death. And for every soldier they send against us who falls, we grow stronger. Every casualty joins our ranks. Every death swells our numbers. Morrison stepped forward. There has to be another way. You want to end the war? There are better methods than terrorizing civilians with an army of corpses. Better methods have been tried. Peace talks, protests, political pressure. None of it works. The machine of war is too powerful, too profitable, too deeply entrenched. So we offer a different approach. Make war so horrifying, so viscerally unacceptable, that even the warmongers cannot stomach it. Make them see
what they send soldiers to become. You're talking about psychological warfare on a global scale, Chen said. We're talking about truth on a global scale. You humans have always had an easy time sending others to die because death happens far away, in places you'll never see, to people you'll never meet. We intend to bring death home, make it close, make it real, make it impossible to ignore. And what about us? Hayes asked. What happens to Bravo Company? You have a choice. Leave now. Walk away from this place and never return. Tell your superiors that the area is untenable, too dangerous to operate in. We will not pursue you. We will not harm you. Simply leave and let us continue our work. And if we refuse, then you join us. You die here tonight, and rise tomorrow to march with your brothers. The outcome is the same either way. More soldiers for our army. The only question is whether you choose to join willingly or are forced. The tension was unbearable. 60 living soldiers surrounded by hundreds of dead ones, all waiting to see what would happen next. Hayes looked at his men, saw the fear in their faces, saw them looking to him for leadership. He'd been trained for many scenarios, but not this, not negotiating with an entity that commanded the dead. We need to consult, Hayes said finally. Give us a moment to discuss among ourselves. The entity inclined its head, a gesture that was almost human, almost respectful. You have until the moon reaches its zenith. When it does, we march again. Choose wisely. It withdrew, and the ring of dead soldiers remained at their positions, unmoving, waiting. Hayes gathered his command element. Morrison, the other platoon leaders, and the seniors, including Callahan. Options? Hayes asked. We can't fight them, Morrison said. We're outnumbered 5-1, and conventional weapons don't seem to stop them. We'd just be adding to their numbers. We can't leave either, another platoon leader argued. We retreat from this. We're admitting defeat to a supernatural enemy. That sets a precedent we can't afford. What about air support? Callahan suggested. Call in napalm. Burn the whole area. Maybe fire can do what bullets can't. And kill ourselves in the process. We're surrounded. By the time air support arrives, we'd be in the blast zone. Then we negotiate, Chen said. We agree to their terms. We leave and report the area as hostile. Let someone higher up the chain of command deal with this. And condemn how many other soldiers to the same situation? Hayes shook his head. I didn't become an officer to abandon problems for someone else to solve. Sir, with respect, this isn't a problem you can solve, Morrison said. That entity, whatever it is, it's beyond our capabilities. We need specialists, people who understand what we're dealing with. Religious experts, maybe. Exorcists, I don't know. But we're combat soldiers, not supernatural investigators. Hayes considered this. He was about to respond when Washington, who'd been on perimeter watch, called out, Sir, we've got movement. Not the dead ones, something else. Everyone grabbed their weapons and moved to Washington's position. Through the trees, illuminated by moonlight, they could see figures approaching. Living figures, moving with tactical awareness, weapons ready. NVA soldiers. A lot of them. What the hell? Morrison breathed. Are they insane? Walking right into this? But as the NVA column came closer, Callahan realized something. They weren't attacking. They were retreating, running from something behind them. And that something was more dead soldiers, pursuing them, herding them toward Bravo Company's position. The NVA soldiers burst into the clearing and stopped when they saw the Americans. For a moment, there was perfect silence as both sides stared at each other. Enemy soldiers, who should have been fighting instead united by terror of what was behind them. Then the dead soldiers emerged from both sides, NVA and American dead mixed together, moving in coordination. The entity appeared, standing between the two groups of living soldiers, and its faceless head turned from one to the other. You see? Its voice echoed in their minds. We do not discriminate. North and South, communist and capitalist, all are equal in death. All join our ranks. All march together toward the same goal. One of the NVA soldiers, an officer based on his insignia, shouted something in Vietnamese. Chen, who spoke some Vietnamese from his family background, translated. He's saying this is a trick, that we're working with the devils to trap them. Tell him we're in the same situation, Hayes said. Tell him we're not his enemy right now. The dead are. Chen called out in Vietnamese, and a tense conversation followed. The NVA officer didn't trust them, that was clear. But he also recognized the reality of their situation. They were surrounded by the dead, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Fighting each other would just add to the entity's army. The entity seemed amused by this, if something without a face could be amused. How interesting. Enemies forced to cooperate by circumstances beyond their control. This is what war does. It creates artificial divisions between people who have more in common than they think. You are all soldiers. You all follow orders. You all kill strangers because someone in power told you to. And you all die far from home for causes you barely understand. We understand plenty, Hayes said. We're fighting for freedom. You're fighting because you were ordered to. If your government had ordered you to fight somewhere else, you would have gone there instead. The cause is irrelevant. What matters is obedience. And that obedience is what killed every soldier standing in these ranks of the dead. The NVA officer said something, and Chen translated. He says the entity is right, that we're all victims of our governments, that if we unite, we could refuse to fight, end the war, ourselves. That's desertion, Morrison said. We'd be court-martialed. Better than being dead, Washington muttered. The entity moved closer, and both groups of living soldiers stepped back. I offer you both the same choice. Leave now. Walk away from this war. We will provide safe passage to neutral territory. Cambodia, Laos, somewhere you can escape the machine that feeds on young lives. Or stay and die, join our ranks, march with us to show the world what war truly costs. The N5EA officer spoke rapidly, and Chen translated. He's asking his men what they want to do. Some want to take the offer.
Others think it's a trap. Hayes looked at his own men. He could see the same division. Some were considering it. Others were loyal to their duty, their country, their training. Callahan fell somewhere in the middle. He wanted to survive, wanted to go home. But he'd also signed up to fight, had taken an oath. Could he really just walk away? The moon reached its zenith. The entity raised its arms. Time is up. Choose now or the choice will be made for you. Captain Hayes made his decision. We're soldiers. We don't run. We don't abandon our duty, no matter how terrifying the situation. But we also don't throw our lives away needlessly. He turned to address both the Americans and, through Chen's translation, the NVA soldiers. I'm ordering Bravo Company to withdraw, not to desert, but to regroup, report what we've found, and return with the resources needed to handle this situation properly. Any man who wants to come with me, you're welcome. Anyone who wants to stay, that's your choice. The NVA officer spoke, and Chen translated. He says his men will also withdraw. They'll allow us safe passage if we do the same for them. Temporary truce. The entity's faceless head tilted, as if surprised. You choose to leave, to go back to the war, to continue killing each other, even after seeing what awaits you? We choose to live, Hayes said. Whatever you're planning, whatever message you think you're sending, it won't work. People will find ways to rationalize it, explain it away, ignore it. They always do. War will continue because humans haven't figured out how to stop it yet. But that doesn't mean we give up. That doesn't mean we stop trying to survive. Then you are fools. And when you die, as you inevitably will, you will join us. And perhaps then you will understand. The entity lowered its arms, and the ring of dead soldiers parted, creating a corridor leading away from the clearing. Hayes didn't hesitate. Bravo Company, move out. Maintain formation. Weapons at ready. But do not fire unless fired upon. The American soldiers moved through the gap, every man tense, expecting at any moment for the dead to attack. But they didn't. They just stood there, watching, with empty eyes, as the living passed by. The NVA soldiers followed, maintaining their own formation, keeping distance from the Americans, but also not showing hostility. As Callahan passed through the line of dead soldiers, he looked at their faces. Some he recognized, men from his own company who'd died in earlier firefights. Others were strangers, from different units, different times. But all of them had the same expression. Not anger, not hatred, just a terrible sadness. They didn't want to be here, didn't want to be dead. They'd been taken from life too early, and now they were trapped in this in-between state, unable to move on, unable to rest. I'm sorry, Callahan whispered to them. I'm sorry this happened to you. One of the dead soldiers, a young private who looked barely old enough to shave, turned his head to look at Callahan. For just a moment, something flickered in those dead eyes. Recognition, gratitude. Then the moment passed, and the dead soldier returned to his rigid stance. Bravo Company and the NVA column walked together through the jungle for about 2 kilometers,
neither side speaking, both hyper-aware of the other's presence. When they reached a fork in the trail, the NVA officer called a halt and spoke to Chen. "He says this is where they part ways," Chen translated. "He thanks Captain Hayes for the cooperation and hopes we don't meet again in combat." Hayes nodded. "Tell him the feeling is mutual, and tell him to stay alive. Don't become like those things back there." The translation was made, and the NVA officer actually smiled. "He says you too." The two columns separated, heading in different directions. Bravo Company made it back to friendly lines just after dawn, exhausted, traumatized, and fundamentally changed by what they'd experienced. They were debriefed by battalion intelligence, by psychological operations specialists, by chaplains, by anyone who might have insight into what they'd encountered. The official report classified the incident as a mass hallucination event brought on by combat stress and possible environmental factors. The area where the dead soldiers had gathered was declared off-limits for American operations and was quietly handed over to South Vietnamese forces to deal with. Those forces, wisely, also avoided the area. But the marching continued. Reports came in from all over Vietnam. Soldiers hearing footsteps in the night, seeing formations of troops that vanished when approached, finding bodies arranged in military formation in places where no one should have died. The dead were still gathering, still organizing, still preparing for their final march. Callahan rotated home 3 months later, his tour complete. He'd survived Vietnam, but he'd never really left it. The nightmares followed him. Dreams of marching dead soldiers, of the entity with no face, of that terrible sadness in the eyes of the young private who'd looked at him. He tried to build a normal life, got a job, got married, had kids. But Vietnam was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for quiet moments to remind him of what he'd seen. He kept in touch with Morrison and Chen and Washington, the survivors of that night. They'd all made it home, all tried to readjust to civilian life, all struggled with the memories. Once a year, they'd meet up, have a few beers, and talk about anything except Vietnam. But inevitably, the conversation would turn to that night, to the choice they'd made, to the question that haunted them all. Had they done the right thing? "We survived," Morrison would say. "That's what matters. We chose life." "But all those soldiers still out there," Chen would counter, "still marching, still waiting. We left them to that. What else could we do? Fight them? We'd have died. Run away entirely? We'd have been deserters. We made the only choice we could." But Washington, quiet Washington, who'd been 18 when he saw the marching dead, always had the final word. What if they're right? What if their way, as horrible as it is, would actually end war? Make people see what they're doing, make them stop. What if we chose wrong? Nobody had an answer for that. The years passed. The Vietnam War ended. The Americans pulled out. Saigon fell. The soldiers came home, or didn't come home, and America tried to forget the whole ugly chapter. But Callahan never forgot. He followed news from Southeast Asia, looking for any mention of unusual phenomena, any reports of the marching dead. there were some stories. Cambodian refugees spoke of seeing armies of ghosts in the jungles. Vietnamese civilians reported entire villages where the dead walked at night. But these stories were dismissed as folklore, as trauma responses from a population that had experienced decades of war. Nobody took them seriously. Nobody wanted to take them seriously. In 1995, 27 years after that night in the jungle, Callahan received a package. No return address, no note, just a videotape. He watched it alone in his basement, not wanting his wife to see. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, somewhere in Southeast Asia based on the terrain. And it showed them, the marching dead, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, all in formation, all marching north. Toward China, toward Russia, toward the nations that had supplied the weapons and support for the war. The entity was there too, at the head of the formation, leading them. Still faceless, still incomprehensible, still carrying out its mission to show the world the cost of war. Callahan destroyed the tape, burned it in his fireplace, and never spoke of it to anyone, because what good would it do? Who would believe him? And even if they did, what could anyone do? The dead were beyond military intervention, beyond political solutions. They were a force of nature now, or something beyond nature. And they would march until they reached their destinations, or until the world finally learned the lesson they were trying to teach. Sometimes, late at night, Callahan would stand at his bedroom window and listen. And once in a while, when the wind was right, he could swear he heard it, the distant sound of marching, of thousands of feet moving in unison, of an army that would never stop, never rest, never surrender until their message was delivered. The marching dead were still out there, still gathering, still preparing. And one day, maybe soon, maybe decades from now, they would complete their journey. They would march through the streets of the world's capitals, an undeniable testament to war's cost. And on that day, humanity would have to choose, finally learn the lesson, or add more soldiers to the ranks of the eternal march. In 2018, 50 years after that night in the jungle, 3 old veterans met at a memorial in Washington, D.C. Callahan, Morrison, and Chen. Washington had passed away 5 years earlier, cancer from Agent Orange exposure. They'd come to pay their respects to the 58,000 names carved into the black granite wall, names of soldiers who died in Vietnam. As they walked along the wall, running their fingers over the engraved names, Callahan felt a presence. He turned and saw a young man, maybe mid-20s, standing at attention near the end of the wall. The young man was wearing a military uniform, but something about it was wrong. The style was dated, from the Vietnam era, and the fabric looked weathered, worn. "Do you see him?" Callahan asked the others. They saw him. The young man turned to look at them, and Callahan recognized those eyes. It was the private, the one who'd looked at him that night in the jungle, the one who'd shown that flicker of recognition. The private raised his hand in a salute, a proper military salute, held steady, unwavering, and behind him, barely visible in the afternoon sun, were others. Hundreds of soldiers in Vietnam-era uniforms, all standing at attention, all saluting the wall where their names were carved. "They're here," Morrison whispered. "In D.C. They made it." "Some of them, at least," Chen said. "Maybe this is as far as they needed to go. Maybe being acknowledged, being remembered. That's enough." The private lowered his salute, and as Callahan watched, he seemed to fade, not disappear entirely, but become less solid, less present. And with him, the other soldiers faded too, their mission accomplished, their message delivered. Callahan returned the salute, holding it until the last of the dead soldiers had vanished into the afternoon light. "Rest now. You've earned it." They never saw the marching dead again. But Callahan knew they were still out there, somewhere, maybe in Vietnam, maybe in other war zones around the world. Wherever young soldiers died before their time, wherever the cost of war was paid in blood and grief, the dead would gather. The dead would march. The dead would try to teach the living the lessons that the living refused to learn. Maybe, someday, the living would finally listen. Author's note: the phenomenon of the marching dead has been reported in various forms throughout military history. From the Roman legions who claimed to hear ghostly armies marching through conquered territories, to World War I, soldiers reporting phantom battalions in no man's land, to modern conflicts, where troops encounter things that defy rational explanation. Whether these reports are true, whether they're mass hallucinations brought on by the stress of combat, or whether they're something else entirely, that's for you to decide. But the pattern exists, documented in military records, personal testimonies, and oral histories passed down through generations of soldiers. What we do know is that war leaves scars, not just on the living, but on the places where it's fought. The ground soaked in blood, the air thick with grief, the psychic weight of so much death in one place. Maybe that's all the marching dead are: echoes of trauma, reverberations of violence that persist long after the guns fall silent. Or maybe there's something more. Maybe they're exactly what they claim to be: soldiers who refuse to let their deaths be forgotten, who march eternally as testament to war's true cost, who try to teach us lessons we desperately need to learn. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to this story. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real military encounters with the unexplained. Share this with anyone who served, anyone who lost someone to war, anyone who needs to hear that the dead are not forgotten. Until next time, remember, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. And those who forget the cost of war are condemned to pay it again and again. The marching dead remember, and they're still trying to make us remember too. This has been The Smoke Pit. Honor the fallen, support the living, and never take peace for granted.